Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight. I am Joan, and tonight we are going to step into Jerusalem in the days of a young king named Josiah, when the city carried the weight of many years, and the house of the Lord stood with worn stones, shadowed chambers, and doors that remembered better worship than the people around them did. We are going to walk softly through courts where priests moved by lamplight, where carpenters lifted beams, where silver was counted for repairs, and where the dust of neglect had settled over more than wood and stone. For somewhere within that ancient temple, beneath the labor of ordinary hands, something holy had been waiting, not lost to God but forgotten by men. Jerusalem did not wake suddenly in those days. It stirred slowly, as old cities do. Morning came first over the higher roofs, laying a pale gold along the walls, touching the upper edges of gates, the backs of donkeys, the clay jars stacked near doorways, and the linen veils of women who had risen before sunrise to grind grain. The city was built on ridges and memory, its streets narrow and uneven, its houses pressed together like people listening for news. From a distance, Jerusalem could still look noble, the city of David, the place where Solomon had built the house of the Lord with cedar, gold, bronze, and prayer. But up close, there were marks of a long forgetting. In corners of the city, altars that should never have stood in Judah had left their stain. Some had already been removed by the command of the young king, and others still seemed to linger as rumors in the hearts of the people. Old habits do not always disappear when the stones are overturned. There were families who remembered fathers and grandfathers bowing in ways the Lord had forbidden. There were elders who had seen kings lead the people into darkness. There were children who did not understand why their parents spoke uneasily when the temple was named. And there was Josiah, son of Ammon, grandson of Manasseh, seated on a throne he had received as a child, carrying a history far older than himself. He had become king when he was only 8 years old, a boy on the throne of Judah, small hands near the seal of the kingdom, young eyes looking out over counselors, guards, priests, scribes, and men who had served under kings who did not fear the Lord. Some may have wondered what such a child could understand. Others may have thought the old corruptions would continue in quieter forms. But Scripture tells us that Josiah did what was right in the sight of the Lord and walked in the ways of David his father, turning neither to the right hand nor to the left. That kind of faithfulness did not rise from the marble of a palace. It rose like a hidden spring in a dry land. And as Josiah grew, the burden inside him grew also. He could see the city. He could hear reports from towns beyond Jerusalem. He knew that Judah had inherited more than walls and fields. It had inherited broken worship, divided loyalties, and holy things treated as common. The temple still stood, but standing is not the same as being honored. Sacrifices might still be brought, songs might still be remembered, priests might still wear their garments, but neglect has a sound of its own. It is heard in hinges that groan because no one has cared for them, in lamps that burn low, in courts where reverence has become routine, in rooms where the dust lies thick because no faithful foot has entered for a long time. By the 18th year of his reign, Josiah was no longer a child. He was still young, but his youth had been shaped by responsibility. He had seen enough to know that a kingdom cannot be healed only by removing what is visibly wrong. Something must be repaired at the center, so he turned his attention to the house of the Lord. The temple in Jerusalem was not merely a building among buildings. It was the place where the Lord had set his name. It was the place of covenant memory, the place where the smoke of offerings rose, where singers had once lifted psalms, where generations had brought their guilt, gratitude, vows, and longing. Its courts had held the footsteps of kings. Its stones had listened to prayers whispered in fear and shouted in joy. But now its structure needed care. Places had fallen into disrepair. The surfaces were worn, the storage rooms cluttered, the order disturbed by years of indifference and misuse. Josiah did not begin with speeches shouted into the streets. He began with a command. He sent Shaphan the scribe, the son of Azaliah, the son of Meshullam, to the house of the Lord. Shaphan was the kind of man trusted with words, records, and royal instructions. A scribe watched details others might miss. He knew the weight of a name, the meaning of an account, the importance of carrying a message exactly as it had been given. When he left the king's presence and went toward the temple, the day had the feel of official purpose. Not noise, not panic, but movement. Something that had been delayed for too long was at last beginning. The streets leading toward the temple rose with the slope of the city. Stone steps held the warmth of the morning. Merchants lowered their voices as officials passed. A few men stepped aside, recognizing Shaphan and those with him. Above them, the temple complex stood in the light, its walls touched by age, its sacred courts opening inward toward spaces not everyone could enter. The closer they came, the more the air changed. The smell of animals, grain, oil, old smoke, stone dust, and priestly linen mingled together. There was holiness there, but there was also work to be done. At the temple, Hilkiah the high priest received the matter. He was responsible for what others could not see from the outer courts. He knew the chambers, the treasuries, the vessels, the rhythms of service, the signs of deterioration. He also knew, perhaps better than most, how much had been neglected before Josiah's reforms began to breathe through Judah. The king's instruction was practical. Gather the money brought into the house of the Lord, the silver collected from the people by the keepers of the threshold, and deliver it into the hands of those who supervise the work. Let it be given to the carpenters, builders, and masons. Let timber and hewn stone be purchased. Let the breaches of the house be repaired. There is something deeply faithful about repair. Not every act of obedience looks like a miracle at first. Sometimes it looks like measuring a beam, lifting a stone, opening a locked chamber, counting coins honestly, or sweeping years of dust from a place that should have been kept clean. Sometimes the return to God begins with hands calloused by ordinary work. In Josiah's day, the Lord's house did not first thunder with revelation. It filled with craftsmen. They came carrying tools wrapped in cloth, men with shoulders shaped by labor, men who knew cedar by smell, stone by sound, bronze by weight. Some had worked on city gates. Some had repaired houses after winter rains. Some had learned from fathers who had learned from their fathers, passing down the art of cutting, fitting, bracing, smoothing, and building. They entered the temple courts not as priests, but as servants of a holy restoration. Their footsteps echoed where worshippers had stood. Their voices were low. Even those accustomed to labor seemed aware that these walls were different. The money was brought out and entrusted to them. Scripture says they dealt faithfully. No accounting was required of the men into whose hands the silver was given, because they acted with honesty. In a kingdom recovering from corruption, that simple sentence shines with quiet strength. They dealt faithfully. In the repair of God's house, trust began to live again among the people. A coin placed in the right hand, a beam purchased for the right purpose, a day's work done without deceit. These were not small things. They were signs that the heart of Judah was being invited back into order. But as the work began, the temple itself seemed to reveal how long it had waited. In one court, damaged stone was examined under slanting light. In another, wooden supports were tested and marked. Dust rose in soft clouds when old storage areas were opened. Lamps were carried into rooms where the air had been trapped for years. Servants moved jars and baskets. Priests lifted vessels that had been left in the wrong places. Threshold keepers sorted what had been received. The sound of tools began to mingle with the murmured duties of worship. the scrape of wood, the tap of hammer and chisel, the creak of rope, the hush of sandals crossing stone. Jerusalem had heard many sounds in its life: the shouts of armies, the songs of pilgrims, the crying of mourners, the commands of kings. But this sound was different. It was the sound of return taking physical form. And Josiah, though not always present in every chamber, was the reason the work had begun. Somewhere in the palace, he would wait for reports. He would want to know that the money had been delivered, that the overseers were appointed, that the workers were faithful, that the house of the Lord was being strengthened. Yet beneath all those visible repairs, another question remained unspoken. What had Judah truly lost? Was it only cedar and stone? Was it only order in the courts? Was it only the beauty of a building once carefully tended and now worn by neglect? Or had something deeper been buried under years of false worship and careless hearts? The workers did not enter that day expecting an answer. Hilkiah did not begin his duties knowing that a hidden thing waited in the temple. Shaphan did not walk from the palace imagining that before long he would carry words back to the king that would make Josiah tear his clothes in grief. The craftsmen did not lift boards and clear chambers thinking that the future of Judah was lying in the dust. They were simply doing the work before them. A priest stooped to examine a storage place. A servant drew back an old covering. Somewhere near the treasury, where offerings had been kept and counted, where silver had passed from the hands of the people into the service of the Lord's house, the shadows held their breath. There were corners in the temple where memory seemed thicker than dust, places where objects had remained untouched because no one had thought to ask what they were, places where silence had gathered around forgotten things. And before the day was over, one of those forgotten things would begin to speak again, not with a human voice, not with the sound of thunder over Jerusalem, but with words written long before Josiah was born, words of covenant, words of warning, words of mercy waiting behind judgment, words that had once been given so Israel would remember who had brought them out of Egypt, who had chosen them, who had called them to walk in his ways. For now, the workers continued. Light shifted across the stones. The smell of old wood rose as beams were moved. Dust clung to the hems of priestly garments. Outside the temple courts, the city carried on, not yet knowing that the repair of a building was about to uncover the wound of a nation. Josiah had asked for restoration, and restoration had begun. But God, in his quiet providence, had prepared more than repaired walls. He had prepared a rediscovery, and in the treasury of the house of the Lord, beneath the marks of time and the evidence of neglect, the first edge of that mystery waited to be found. Within the house of the Lord, the work did not move quickly at first. It began with the patience of hands that knew they were touching more than stone. Men entered the chambers in the pale light of morning, carrying baskets, cords, oil lamps, small tools of iron and wood, and the careful attention of those who had been commanded by the king to repair what had long been left in decline. The temple had not lost its holiness, for the Lord who had placed his name there was not changed by the neglect of men. Yet the building bore the marks of years when Judah's heart had wandered. Dust had settled where worship should have been tended. Corners had darkened. Wooden beams had weakened. Treasuries and side rooms held the memory of former days, some carefully arranged, others crowded with objects that had been moved and forgotten. The workers spoke little. Their sandals brushed across the floor. Their fingers tightened around handles and ropes. A bowl was lifted from a shelf and wiped with linen. A cracked vessel was carried away. A fallen piece of carved work was set aside for repair. From the open courts, faint sounds drifted in. The muted call of a merchant beyond the gates, the low murmur of Levites, the measured strike of tools against stone. Everything inside seemed to answer with a softer sound, as if the temple itself was listening. Hilkiah, the high priest, moved among them with a gravity that made others lower their voices. He had served through seasons when obedience had been thin in the land, when altars to other gods had stood too boldly, when things that should have grieved the people had become familiar to them. Now Josiah, young yet determined, had sent men to strengthen the house of the Lord. Silver had been gathered from the people, from Manasseh and Ephraim and all the remnant of Israel, from Judah and Benjamin, and from the inhabitants of Jerusalem. The money had been given to the overseers, and the overseers had given it to craftsmen. Carpenters, builders, masons, and repairers had begun their task. There was trust in the work, such trust that no accounting was demanded of the men who handled it, because they dealt faithfully. Still, Hilkiah knew that repairing walls was not the same as healing a people. A beam could be replaced, a stone reset, a door hung straight upon its hinges. But what had bent within Judah could not be mended by tools alone. That knowledge stayed with him as he passed from chamber to chamber, watching the old disorder yield bit by bit to care. In one of the storage rooms, where the air was cooler and heavier, several men worked by lamplight. Narrow shafts of day slipped through small openings high in the wall, catching dust in pale streams. Shelves had been built into the stone. Some held vessels wrapped in cloth. Others held offerings and objects once used in service, their exact purpose remembered by the older priests but unfamiliar to younger hands. There were jars, worn boxes, lengths of fabric, bronze implements dulled by age, and wooden chests whose lids resisted opening because time had settled into every joint. A worker bent over one such chest and drew back, not in fear but in uncertainty. "My lord," he said quietly. Hilkiah turned. The man's hands were on the edge of something tucked beneath folded cloth and fragments of old material. It was not large. It did not gleam. It was not shaped like treasure in the way men often imagine treasure. The lamp beside it flickered across a rounded form, a wrapped scroll, its outer covering marked by age. The cloth around it had darkened. The cord was brittle. Dust lay along the creases like fine ash. Hilkiah stepped nearer. For a moment no one moved. The sounds from the outer court seemed to fall away, leaving only the small breath of the flame. He reached down carefully. His fingers did not snatch or hurry. He lifted the scroll as one lifts something that may break if handled without reverence. The weight of it was modest in his hands, but something in him grew solemn at once. There are discoveries that announce themselves with brightness, and there are discoveries that disturb the heart by how quietly they appear. This was the latter, a hidden thing brought out of darkness, a witness from former days, a voice waiting beneath dust. Hilkiah turned it slightly toward the light. The covering gave way enough for him to see the writing. His eyes followed the marks, and the stillness in the room deepened. The characters were not random. They were not records of repairs or lists of vessels. They were words of covenant, words given to Israel, words that named the Lord, his commands, his statutes, his warnings, his mercy, his jealousy, his holiness. The book of the law. A tremor did not pass through the room, yet something had shifted. The men around him did not fully understand it, but they understood Hilkiah's face. He did not look like a man who had found an object. He looked like a man who had heard a door open behind him. A door into the forgotten seriousness of God. The scroll had been there while kings rose and fell. It had been there while incense to false gods stained the hills. It had been there while children grew up learning customs that should never have been taught. It had remained hidden while the temple gathered dust, while the people carried on, while the name of the Lord still rested over Jerusalem. And yet his words were no longer trembling in the public heart. And before the day was finished, those words would no longer remain within that chamber. Hilkiah held the book close and looked around at the room. The old shelves, the loosened cloth, the workers frozen in their tasks, the lamp with its small flame leaning in the draught. Everything looked ordinary, and yet nothing was ordinary now. A kingdom could ignore a ruined wall for a time, but what could it do when the law itself was placed again into the hands of the priest? He did not speak quickly. When he did, his voice was low. "I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord." The sentence entered the room with more force than shouting. One worker lowered his eyes. Another looked toward the doorway, as if the words might already be traveling outward. Hilkiah knew the book must be brought to someone who could read it before the king. Not hidden again. Not placed upon a shelf while repairs continued. It had come forth now in the days of Josiah, and there was a reason for the timing, though its fullness had not yet been revealed. Outside, the light had strengthened, touching the inner courts with a warm tone that made the pale stones seem almost alive. Men crossed the pavement with timber and worked along damaged places. A mason knelt and examined a crack. Levites passed with measured steps. The restoration continued, unaware that another kind of restoration had begun in a side room, with a scroll in the hands of a high priest. Hilkiah sent for Shaphan the scribe. Shaphan came through the court with the composed manner of a man accustomed to carrying words between temple and throne. He was the son of Azaliah, the son of Meshullam, and he had been entrusted by the king with the business of the repair. He knew the language of administration. Money counted and delivered, orders given, craftsmen supplied, reports carried faithfully back to Josiah. His work required clarity, careful speech, and a steady mind. Yet when he entered and saw Hilkiah standing with the aged scroll, he slowed. There was no need for many explanations. Hilkiah's face prepared him before the words did. "I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord," the priest said again. Then he gave the scroll to Shaphan. The scribe received it with both hands. The transfer was simple, but it carried the solemnity of an offering. For a brief moment, priest and scribe stood facing one another, the found book between them. Hilkiah had uncovered it from within the Lord's house. Shaphan would carry it beyond the temple chambers toward the king. The law, silent for so long in its hidden place, was beginning to move. Shaphan looked down at the scroll. Perhaps he had seen many writings, decrees, genealogies, records, letters, measures of silver, accounts of labor. But this was different. This was not merely writing to be preserved. This was writing that addressed the life of the nation. It reached backward to Moses and forward into judgment and mercy. It held blessings that Judah had not cherished and warnings Judah had not feared. It spoke not as a relic, but as covenant. He did not yet know how deeply the king would be struck when the words were read aloud. He did not yet see Josiah tearing his garments in grief. He did not yet hear messengers being sent to inquire of the Lord. But already the road from temple chamber to royal presence felt changed beneath him. There was a reason this discovery had not been made by a careless hand, and there was a reason it had not remained buried for another generation. The workers returned slowly to their tasks, though the room no longer felt the same. The chest from which the scroll had come sat open. Folded cloth lay aside. Dust had been disturbed, and under that disturbance was a sign. Hilkiah remained for a moment, watching Shaphan prepare to depart. The high priest's thoughts may have moved through the long memory of Israel. Sinai, the wilderness, the Jordan crossed, the land given, the kings appointed, the prophets sent, the sins repeated. The Lord had spoken, and his speech had not lost its claim. The neglect of the people had not erased a single word. Shaphan stepped out from the chamber into the broader light of the temple. The scroll was held with care, close enough that he could guard it from the press of movement. Around him the work continued, but now each sound seemed to belong to a larger pattern. the rasp of stone being shaped, the creak of wood, the murmur of instructions, the faint ring of metal. These were the sounds of a building restored by human hands. Yet under them, unheard by most, was another sound beginning, the return of the word of the Lord to the hearing of the king. He crossed the courts. The afternoon light slanted more softly now, touching pillars and thresholds. Shadows stretched along the ground. A priest passed and glanced at what he carried, then looked away with respect. Near the gate, a group of craftsmen paused as a beam was adjusted into place. The beam settled with a low wooden groan, as if the house itself were receiving support. Shaphan moved past them, and the image remained behind him. The temple being strengthened while the covenant, once hidden within it, was carried out into the open. Jerusalem waited beyond the temple precincts. Its streets held the ordinary life of the day. Women drawing water, children moving near doorways, elders seated where judgment and talk often gathered, traders closing baskets, animals shifting in narrow lanes. None of them yet knew what had been found. They did not know that a scroll was passing through their city, held in the hands of a scribe, and that its words would soon fall upon the conscience of their king. They did not know that the repair of broken places had uncovered something far more searching than damaged stone. Shaphan walked toward the royal house with his report. He would tell Josiah that the money had been delivered to the workmen, and that those who labored in the house of the Lord were carrying out the king's command. That was expected. That was the business of the day. But there was another matter, almost small enough in the telling to be missed by a careless ear. Hilkiah the priest has given me a book, so simple a sentence, so modest on the tongue, yet within it waited a summons that would bend the young king low before God. The scroll did not thunder as Shaphan carried it. It made no sound at all. But the silence around it had become full, as if Jerusalem itself had drawn near without knowing why. And as the scribe approached the place where Josiah would receive him, the day settled toward evening, and the forgotten book drew nearer to the throne. Shaphan entered the chamber carrying the scroll with both hands, though it was not heavy in the way stones are heavy, or beams or shields or jars filled with oil. Its weight was older than the hands that held it. It was the weight of words given by God and neglected by men. The king looked up from the matters of repair, from the lists of silver counted, from the names of workmen and overseers, and saw in the scribe's face that this was not an ordinary report. The room had grown dimmer as evening gathered around the palace. Lamps had been lit, their small flames bending whenever a servant passed too near. Beyond the latticed openings, Jerusalem softened into layers of clay roofs, narrow passages, smoke rising from cooking fires, and the pale outline of the temple standing above the city like a memory that had not finished speaking. Josiah sat where kings sat, yet something in him remained like a boy who had once inherited a throne too early, surrounded by the ruins of choices he had not made. Shaphan bowed and gave his report with practiced steadiness. The money had been delivered. The workmen were laboring faithfully. The carpenters, builders, and masons were restoring the house of the Lord. No accounting was required of the men because they dealt honestly. These were good words, hopeful words, the kind that could have ended the day with satisfaction. The temple was being repaired. Order was returning. The sound of hammers against stone had become a sign that Judah might yet turn back. But Shaphan did not leave. He remained before the king, and the scroll lay in his hands. Then he said, as if speaking a small thing, "Hilkiah the priest has given me a book." The king's eyes moved from Shaphan's face to the scroll. There was no jeweled case, no royal seal newly pressed into wax, no procession of trumpets to announce it. Only parchment worn by years, marked by hands that belonged to earlier days. The edges bore the tenderness of age. The binding had the look of something that had waited in the dark while generations rose and fell outside. Josiah did not reach for it. "Read it," he said. The words were simple, but when they were spoken, the servants in the chamber seemed to become aware of their own breathing. A guard shifted his weight and then became motionless. The flames in the lamps trembled. Shaphan opened the scroll carefully, smoothing the ancient folds, and began to read in the hearing of the king. At first, the sound was only a voice moving through the room, syllables shaped by the scribe's mouth, lines drawn from the page and given again to the air. But soon the words ceased to feel like old writing. They became presence. They entered the chamber as if they had always belonged there, as if the stone walls, the cedar beams, the lamp smoke, and the king's own heart recognized them before his mind could fully receive them. The covenant spoke. It told of the Lord who had brought his people out of bondage, who had chosen them, carried them, commanded them, warned them, and set before them blessing and curse. It spoke of obedience not as a cold duty, but as life held near to the God who had made himself known. It spoke of turning aside, of serving other gods, of forsaking the commandments, of forgetting the one who had redeemed them. It spoke with the clarity of morning light over a valley, leaving no corner hidden. Josiah listened. His face did not change quickly. At first he sat as a king receiving an ancient law. Then slowly, the words began to uncover him. Not accuse him only, but uncover him, the way a roof torn away shows what weather has done inside a house. He thought of the temple before the repairs began. The dust gathered where holy service should have been kept with reverence. He thought of altars raised where they should never have stood. He thought of the high places scattered through Judah, of incense burned in wrong places to wrong names, of images carried, bowed before, hidden, defended, inherited. The scribe read on. Each sentence seemed to reach beyond the king's chamber and pass through the streets of Jerusalem. It entered doorways where household gods lay tucked among family possessions. It moved toward the hills where fires had been lit in disobedience. It drifted over the fields where children had heard the names of false gods spoken as casually as weather. It stood in the courts where priests had served with divided hearts. It touched the memory of kings who had led the people into darkness, and of people who had followed because the path had become familiar. But what shook Josiah most was not only that Judah had sinned. He had known enough to grieve over that. What struck him deeper was that the people had learned to live without hearing. They had continued their feasts, their trades, their marriages, their songs, their judgments, their planting and harvesting, while the voice of the covenant lay forgotten in the house of the Lord. The scroll had not been lost in a foreign land. It had not been burned by an enemy or carried off by raiders. It had been within reach, hidden by neglect, buried under years of disordered worship and careless days. And before the evening was over, Josiah would understand that a forgotten book can reveal a forgotten heart. Shaphan's voice did not rise. He did not add grief of his own to make the words stronger. He did not need to. The words were strong enough. They spoke of judgment with a patience more terrible than anger, because the warnings had been given long before the consequences arrived. They spoke of a people treasured by God, yet capable of wandering so far that they no longer trembled at his commands. They spoke of covenant faithfulness from the Lord and covenant breaking from the nation. The chamber had become very still. Josiah's hands tightened on the arms of his seat. The lamp nearest him sent a line of gold along his sleeve, across the embroidery of royal cloth, over fabric fit for a king. But beneath that cloth was a man, and beneath the crown was a soul now standing exposed before the words of God. He saw his own reign differently. The repairs to the temple, once a noble beginning, were no longer enough. New stones could not answer old rebellion. Mended doors could not heal worship that had been bent toward idols. Silver weighed out to craftsmen could not undo years in which the covenant had gone unread. The house of the Lord needed restoration, yes, but so did the people who had forgotten why the house was holy. Shaphan continued, and the curses written in the book came like distant thunder heard from beyond the hills. Not loud in the chamber, not violent in the mouth of the scribe, but certain, famine, desolation. The Lord's anger kindled because his people had forsaken him, words that no faithful king could dismiss, words that no tender conscience could hear and remain untouched. Then the moment came when Josiah could sit no longer under the appearance of composure. He rose. Those near him lowered their eyes. The king's face had gone pale, not with weakness but with recognition. He reached for the fabric of his garments, the royal covering that marked him as ruler in Judah, and with a sudden, sorrowful motion he tore them. The sound cut through the chamber, sharper than the turning of parchment, sharper than the faint crackle of lamp flame. Cloth gave way in his hands. It was the sign of grief, the sign of anguish, the sign of a heart refusing to pretend that all was well. No one spoke. Torn fabric hung from the king's shoulders. The young ruler of Judah stood in the dim lamplight, stripped of the illusion that a throne could shield a nation from the word of the Lord. In that tear was confession without a speech. In that sound was the breaking of pride, the collapse of distance, the admission that the disaster written in the scroll was not ancient history. It was near. It was deserved. It belonged to the very people over whom he had been called to reign. Yet Josiah did not turn away from the book. That was the first sign of hope. He did not command Shaphan to close it. He did not hide it again. He did not soften the words or search for someone to flatter him with an easier meaning. He let the grief do its proper work. He allowed the covenant to wound what needed wounding. And in the place where fear might have hardened another king, humility began to form. At last Josiah spoke, and his voice carried the strain of a man who had heard not merely information but summons. "Go," he commanded, "inquire of the Lord for me and for the people and for all Judah concerning the words of this book that has been found." The words moved through the chamber like a door opening toward an unseen path. For me, for the people, for all Judah. He did not separate himself from them, though he had sought the Lord more earnestly than many before him. He did not stand above the nation as if their guilt were only theirs. He stood beneath the word with them. The king who tore his garments now gathered the whole people into his plea. If judgment was written, then they must know it. If mercy remained, they must seek it from the Lord himself. He continued, and the reason for his grief became plain. Great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our fathers have not obeyed the words of this book, to do according to all that is written concerning us. Against us, the phrase settled heavily, not against strangers, not against the memory of men long buried only, against us. The sins of the fathers had become the danger of the sons. The disobedience of previous generations had shaped streets where children now played, worship where priests now served, habits that felt ordinary because no one living remembered when they first went wrong. And yet the king sent messengers. Hilkiah the priest was called. Ahikam son of Shaphan came near. Echbor, Shaphan himself, and Asaiah the king's servant were named for the task. Men of trust, men who could carry trembling questions without twisting them. The scroll lay open, but the next step had to be prayerful inquiry. The written word had awakened the wound. Now they must seek the Lord for the answer. Outside, evening had deepened over Jerusalem. The final red of sunset withdrew from the upper stones, and blue shadow gathered in the valleys between houses. A woman covered the mouth of a jar and called a child indoors. A merchant drew a cloth across his goods. Somewhere a Levite's lamp was trimmed. The city did not yet know that messengers would soon move through its streets, carrying a question more urgent than any matter of trade or repair. Was mercy still possible? The men prepared to go. Sandals were fastened. Cloaks were drawn close. Faces were grave but not frantic. This was not the panic of men who had no God. This was the sober haste of servants sent to inquire of the Lord whose word had found them. The palace doorway opened, and cooler air entered the room, carrying the scent of stone, ash, and distant cooking fires. Josiah remained near the torn place in his garment, the scroll not far from him, its words still alive in the chamber. The king had heard enough to be broken, but not enough yet to know the end. That was the unresolved mercy of the night. The book had been found. The sin had been named. The grief had begun. But the answer of the Lord still waited somewhere beyond the palace walls. And as the messengers stepped out into the darkening city, Jerusalem lay beneath the deepening sky, unaware that the path toward judgment or compassion would now pass through a prophet's house, where the next word from God was waiting to be spoken. The men sent by Josiah passed out from the palace into the evening streets, with the weight of the king's torn robe still before their eyes. They did not walk as men carrying an ordinary question. They walked as those who had heard the words of the covenant fall upon the heart of a ruler like rain upon broken ground. And now, they were being sent to ask whether there was mercy beyond the sentence. Jerusalem had begun to darken. The last warmth of day clung to the upper stones of the city, touching roofs and walls with a fading amber, while the lower streets cooled into blue shadow. Lamps were being lit within houses. Small flames appeared one by one behind lattice and doorway. A woman drew water before the gate of her courtyard. A potter covered his vessels. A father called a child indoors. From somewhere near the Temple Mount came the muted sound of tools being set down for the night, the restoration work pausing until morning. But for Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam son of Shaphan, Echbor, Shaphan the scribe, and Asaiah the king's servant, the day had not ended. A greater work had opened before them, one that no mason could mend with stone, and no craftsman could smooth with cedar. The question now was not whether the temple could be repaired. The question was whether the people themselves could be awakened before the words written in the book came to pass. They went through the city toward the place where Huldah the prophetess lived. She was the wife of Shallum, keeper of the wardrobe, and she dwelt in Jerusalem in the second quarter, that part of the city where households leaned close along the slopes and streets curved between walls with the memory of many generations. It was not the grandest place in Jerusalem. It was not the throne room. It was not the holy place where lamps burned before the Lord. Yet the word of God has never been confined to the places men expect. Sometimes it comes in a palace. Sometimes it comes near a river. Sometimes it comes to a shepherd behind the wilderness. And sometimes, in an evening of national trembling, it waits in the house of a faithful woman whose name will be remembered because she spoke what the Lord gave her to speak. The delegation moved carefully, not hurried in a way that disturbed the street, yet not slowly either. Their sandals pressed the worn paths between houses. The smell of evening bread drifted out through low doorways. Smoke from cooking fires lifted and flattened beneath the cooling air. Somewhere a lamb bleated from an enclosure. A priest returning home glanced at Hilkiah and read something solemn in his face, but did not ask. The city was full of ordinary motions, unaware that 5 men were carrying the anguish of a king through its streets. And before they reached Huldah's door, there was a silence among them deeper than the silence of the road. Each man had his own memory of the words Shaphan had read, curses upon disobedience, warnings for a people who forsook the covenant, the terrible seriousness of belonging to the Lord and yet turning after other gods. Those words had not been vague. They had cut through years of neglect and named the hidden rot beneath outward life. Jerusalem had a temple again being repaired, but the book had revealed that repair of wood and stone was not enough. Hilkiah may have felt the particular burden of a priest. The book had been found in the house of the Lord, in the very place where the law should have been cherished, read, guarded, and obeyed. Its rediscovery was a mercy, but it was also a rebuke. Ahikam, son of the scribe's house, may have understood the gravity of written words entrusted to a people who had forgotten to listen. Shaphan himself had read the scroll aloud before the king. He had watched Josiah's face change. He had seen reverence become grief, and grief become resolve. Now he walked beneath the evening sky, knowing that the next word he heard would shape the path of Judah. When they came to Huldah's dwelling, the city around them had become dim. A small lamp burned within. Its flame did not make the house grand, but it made the doorway visible. The men stood before it for a moment, and there was something fitting in that. The rulers and servants of the king had come not to command, but to inquire. They did not arrive with music or ceremony. They came with torn-hearted urgency. They had the book. They had the king's question. They needed the Lord's answer. Huldah received them. The scripture gives only the clean lines of the moment. They spoke to her. She answered. But in those few words lies a scene of great spiritual weight. The men likely told her what had happened. The repairs of the temple, the discovery of the book, the reading before Josiah, the tearing of his clothes, the command to inquire of the Lord. They may have repeated the king's concern, that the wrath of the Lord was kindled because the fathers had not obeyed the words of the book, to do according to all that was written concerning them. Huldah listened. She did not soften the matter by pretending it was small. She did not turn the message into comfort before truth had done its work. A prophet's faithfulness is not measured by the pleasantness of the word, but by whether the word belongs to the Lord. And when she spoke, the small room became, for that hour, the place where heaven's answer entered Judah's history. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel," she said, and directed the men to tell the one who had sent them. The words must have steadied every man in the room. They had not come for opinion. They had not come for strategy. They had not come for a court advisor's calculation. They had come to know what the Lord would say, and Huldah began where all true prophecy begins, not with herself but with him. The message was severe. The Lord would bring disaster upon the place and upon its inhabitants, all the words of the book that the king of Judah had read. The reason was plain. They had forsaken him. They had burned incense to other gods. They had provoked him with the works of their hands. The anger of the Lord would be kindled against that place, and it would not be quenched. There, in the lamplight, the fear that had risen in Josiah's heart was confirmed. The book had not been misunderstood. The covenant warnings were not distant poetry. They belonged to Judah. They stood over Jerusalem like a long-delayed storm. Generations of rebellion had not disappeared simply because one young king had begun to repair what was broken. The Lord is patient, but his patience is not forgetfulness. He had seen the altars. He had heard the false prayers. He had known the secret compromises, the public evils, the years when his law lay ignored while the people walked after what could not save. And yet the message did not end with disaster. This is where the night deepened, and with it the mercy of God became strangely clear. For the men had also come because of Josiah, and the Lord had seen him too, not merely as a king, not merely as David's son on the throne of Judah. The Lord had seen his heart. Huldah continued with a word specifically for the king of Judah, who had sent them to inquire of the Lord. Because his heart was tender, because he humbled himself before the Lord when he heard what God had spoken against that place and its inhabitants, because he tore his clothes and wept before him, the Lord had heard him. The Lord had heard him. Those words must have entered the room like a lamp being lifted higher. They did not erase the warning. They did not undo the long guilt of the nation, but they revealed something more intimate than judgment and more personal than history. The God who spoke against Judah's rebellion had also noticed the trembling of one responsive soul. Josiah's grief had not vanished into the air. His torn garment had been seen. His tears had been received. His humility had reached the ears of the Lord. There is a mystery here, and it is not harsh. It is holy. A whole nation had drifted for years, but when one heart became tender before the word, heaven marked it. Josiah could not pretend the sins of the fathers were not real. He could not rewrite the covenant. He could not rule so skillfully that judgment became unnecessary. Yet he could humble himself. He could hear the word and not defend himself against it. He could allow the book to judge him rather than placing himself above the book. And in that tender response, he found grace. Huldah spoke the promise. The Lord would gather Josiah to his fathers. He would be gathered to his grave in peace. His eyes would not see all the disaster that the Lord would bring upon that place. The men listened, and the meaning settled slowly. Josiah would not be spared because the message was false. He would be spared because the Lord is attentive to humility. The nation's long rebellion would still bear its fruit, but the king's tender heart would not be treated as nothing. Judgment and grace stood together, not confusing one another, but revealing the character of God with piercing clarity. The Lord does not ignore sin. The Lord does not overlook repentance. Perhaps Shaphan lowered his eyes when he heard it. Perhaps Hilkiah felt the ache of both relief and sorrow. For what kind of answer was this? It was not the simple comfort any messenger might wish to carry back. It did not say, "All is well." It said something more truthful and therefore more powerful. It said that the Lord had spoken. It said that the calamity was deserved. It said that Josiah's humility mattered. It said that God had heard. Outside, the city continued beneath the evening. Families ate. Lamps flickered. The temple stones cooled under the night air. Men and women passed in narrow streets, not knowing that the destiny of their generation had just been interpreted in a prophetess's house. But the messengers knew. They had come carrying a question. They would return carrying an answer that was both burden and balm. And as they stepped away from Huldah's dwelling, the darkness of Jerusalem no longer felt empty. It was full of meaning. Every stone of the city seemed to bear witness. Every distant outline of roof and wall reminded them that God had named this place, warned this place, and still listened when a king bowed low before him. They walked back through the second quarter with the words repeating within them, "Because your heart was tender, because you humbled yourself, because you tore your clothes and wept before me. I also have heard you." The message did not flatter Josiah. It did not praise his reforms as though outward work alone could heal the breach. It went deeper, to the unseen place where a person either resists the Lord or yields. Josiah's greatness was not first that he commanded workers, cleansed the land, or sat upon David's throne. His greatness in that hour was that he did not harden himself when the word exposed the truth. He trembled and he turned. He mourned and he sought. He listened and the Lord heard him. This is the turning point of the story, not because the danger disappeared, but because the meaning of the danger became clear. The found book was not merely an artifact of the past. It was a living witness before God's people. It revealed that the Lord's covenant words had remained true even when forgotten by men. It revealed that neglect does not weaken his voice. It revealed that a humble heart can meet the word of judgment and find, even there, a doorway into mercy. The men neared the palace again. Above them, Jerusalem's sky had darkened fully. The city's sounds had grown fewer, softer, more enclosed. A guard shifted near an entrance. A lamp burned in an upper chamber where the king waited. Josiah did not yet know the answer, but soon he would. Soon he would hear that the Lord had confirmed the coming calamity. Soon he would hear that his tears had been noticed by heaven. Soon the sorrow that tore his robe would become the courage to gather the people, read the book aloud, and stand before the Lord in covenant. But for this moment, the messengers carried the word through the last stretch of night-shadowed stone. Their footsteps returned toward the king, and with them came a truth both solemn and consoling. The word of God may wound before it heals, but it never fails to see the heart that bows before it. By the time the messengers returned to Josiah, the city had drawn itself into night. Jerusalem's streets had narrowed into darkness between the stone houses. Small lamps burned behind shutters. Watchmen stood along the walls with cloaks pulled around their shoulders, listening to the faint movement of wind over the high places and roof lines. The temple rose above the city in deep shadow, its repaired stones holding the last memory of torchlight, its courts waiting for footsteps that had not yet come. Inside the palace, Josiah received the word of the Lord. The message from Huldah did not soften the sin of Judah. It did not pretend that the years of forgetting had been small. The Lord had seen the idols, the stubbornness, the turning away, the worship given to what could not save. Judgment would come upon the place because the covenant had been forsaken. But the word did not end there, because Josiah's heart had been tender, because he had humbled himself when he heard what was written, because he had torn his garments and wept before the Lord. God had heard him. The king would not see the coming disaster with his own eyes. He would be gathered to his grave in peace before the fullness of judgment fell. Josiah listened. The torches in the chamber trembled slightly, casting warm light over the faces of priests, scribes, and servants. No one hurried to speak. This was not the kind of message a man answered quickly. It was too heavy for pride, too holy for noise. The king stood beneath it as a man stands beneath a sky suddenly cleared of clouds, seeing not only what is above him, but what has always been above him. He had asked whether there was a word from the Lord. Now he had received it, and before the night was over, one thing became clear within him. The book had not been found so that he might grieve alone. It had been found so that Judah might hear. When morning came, Josiah did not keep the scroll hidden in the chambers of power. He did not let its words remain the private sorrow of a young king or the secret burden of priests. He sent through Jerusalem and beyond Jerusalem, calling the elders of Judah and all the people to gather at the house of the Lord. The city changed as the summons moved through it. Men left their work at doorways and workshops. Women paused at grinding stones and wells. Families came from streets rising and falling across the hills. Elders came with measured steps, leaning on staffs polished by years of use. Priests entered by their appointed ways. Levites took their places. Those who had heard rumors of the found book whispered quietly, wondering what would be read and what it would require. The temple courts filled. Morning light spread over the pale stone, catching the edges of carved work and repaired beams. Dust rose from many sandals, but the air did not feel common. It felt gathered, held, as though the whole nation had been brought to a threshold. Children stood close to their parents. Old men lifted their faces. Servants and officials stood not far from one another. In that hour, rank mattered less than hearing. All were under the word that had been neglected. All had lived within the mercy of a God who had spoken long before they remembered to listen. Josiah went up to the house of the Lord. He was still young, but he did not stand as a boy in that moment. He stood as king, as son of David, as one who had been shaken awake by the voice of God in a discovered scroll. There may have been signs of sorrow still upon him. The torn garment had told the truth of his heart, yet now his grief had become obedience. He did not come merely to mourn what Judah had been. He came to lead them toward what the covenant still required. The book was brought forth. not as an ornament, not as a relic, not as something admired from a distance because it was old. It was brought forth to be heard, and Josiah read. The words rose in the temple courts, moving over priests and elders, over families and laborers, over the young and the aged. Commandments long ignored returned to the air. Promises once spoken came alive again. Warnings, blessings, statutes, the call to love the Lord with all the heart, with all the soul, and with all the strength. The people heard the shape of the covenant that had formed them before they had forgotten its sound. There was no need for thunder. The reading itself was enough. Each sentence seemed to uncover something buried not under stone, but within the nation's own memory. The God who had brought Israel out of Egypt had not changed. The Lord who gave the law through Moses had not grown distant in his own faithfulness. It was the people who had wandered. It was their hearing that had dimmed. It was their devotion that had been divided. And as Josiah read, the repaired temple became more than restored architecture. It became a witness. Its stones seemed to say that damage could be named. Neglect could be confessed. What had been broken could be set in order again, not because Judah deserved such mercy, but because the Lord had not ceased to call. Then the king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord. He pledged to walk after the Lord, to keep his commandments, his testimonies, and his statutes with all his heart and all his soul, to perform the words of the covenant written in the book. The people stood with him. They entered into the covenant. The moment was solemn but not empty. It was not the excitement of a crowd moved only by emotion. It was a returning, a bending back toward the path. A nation, at least for this bright and serious hour, hearing again that the Lord was not one voice among many, not one altar among many, not one hope among many. He was their God. From that gathering, Josiah's obedience moved outward. The work did not end with words spoken in the temple courts. The king removed what had defiled worship. He cast down what had drawn hearts away. He put away idols, false altars, and the signs of divided devotion. Across Judah and even into places marked by old disobedience, he acted with a firmness born not of anger alone, but of covenant clarity. The book had named the truth, and the king would not pretend otherwise. Yet at the center of his reform was not only removal, there was remembrance. Josiah commanded that the Passover be kept to the Lord in Jerusalem, as it was written in the book of the covenant. And so preparation began. The temple that had heard the book read now received the ordered movement of worship. Priests and Levites took their places according to their divisions. Lambs were prepared. Families gathered. Instructions were followed with care. The story of deliverance, older than the kingdom, older than Josiah's throne, returned to the center of Judah's life. The night of Passover carried a memory deeper than any single generation. It remembered bondage in Egypt. It remembered doors marked with blood. It remembered haste, unleavened bread, bitter herbs, the staff in hand, the Lord passing over his people and bringing them out with a mighty hand. It remembered that Israel had not saved itself. It remembered that freedom began with God's mercy. Under Josiah, that remembrance became bright again. The people kept the Passover in a way not seen for generations. The old command was no longer only ink on parchment. It became flame, meal, song, obedience, gathering. It became fathers telling sons and mothers guiding daughters through the meaning of the night. It became priests serving in ordered devotion. It became the nation standing inside its own story again, not as owners of mercy, but as receivers of it. And there was a reason this feast followed the finding of the book. The scroll had shown Judah its guilt, but Passover showed Judah the character of the God who calls guilty people back. He is holy, and his word is not light. He judges evil and does not bless rebellion. Yet he is also the God who makes a way of deliverance, who remembers promises, who brings slaves out of darkness, who teaches his people to mark time not by their failures alone, but by his saving acts. As evening settled over Jerusalem after the feast, the city carried a different sound, not loud triumph, not the proud noise of a people imagining that one ceremony could erase every consequence. It was quieter than that and more truthful. It was the sound of a people who had heard. The sound of doors closing after households had remembered the mercy of God. The sound of Levites finishing their service. The sound of fires lowering. The sound of the temple standing clean beneath the darkening heavens. The scroll no longer forgotten. Josiah could not turn back every year that had been lost. He could not make all coming sorrow disappear. The word from the Lord had been honest about what would come after him. But he had been given his time, and in his time he turned toward the Lord with all his heart, all his soul, and all his might. There was no king like him in that devotion, turning according to all the law of Moses. That is where the story settles, not in the illusion that obedience removes every earthly shadow, but in the deeper consolation that God sees the heart that bows. He saw a young king tremble before the book. He heard tears shed in secret chambers. He answered through a prophet. He gathered a people to hear what had been neglected. He restored remembrance through Passover. He let a forgotten word become a public light again. Now Jerusalem grows dark, the temple courts empty. The last sandals pass beyond the gates. The stone pavement cools under the night air. In the house of the Lord, the scroll rests with honor, no longer hidden beneath the dust of years. Its words have gone out into the minds of the people, into their homes, into the memory of children who will one day recall the morning the king read aloud. The repaired beams hold their place above shadowed chambers. The bronze and gold no longer catch the sun, but keep a low memory of it. Far above the city, the sky deepens. The hills around Jerusalem become dark shapes, guarding the place where worship has been renewed. And the story leaves us there, not with noise, but with trust. For there are seasons when the word of God seems forgotten by men, yet it is never lost to God. There are chambers of the heart where dust gathers, and places in a life where obedience has been delayed. But the Lord knows how to uncover what must be heard. He knows how to bring his truth into the open at the appointed time. He knows how to wound pride without crushing the tender heart. He knows how to call his people back through remembrance, covenant, and mercy. Josiah found the forgotten book, but truly the God of the book found Josiah. And under the dark shelter of night, with Jerusalem quiet around the temple, that truth remains. The Lord speaks after long silence. He receives the humble. He remembers his covenant. He leads his people from neglect into remembrance, from sorrow into obedience, from fear into faithful surrender. The lamps grow small. The streets soften into shadow. The temple stands repaired. The scroll is honored. The feast has been kept. The king has done what was given to him to do. And now the city sleeps beneath the care of the God who had never forgotten his word.